The day dawned gray over London, as if even the sky mourned the nation's loss. The bells of Westminster Abbey echoed solemnly through the streets, announcing the death of King Henry VIII, a monarch whose reign had marked an era of profound changes and challenges for the United Kingdom. News of his passing spread like wildfire, and in every corner of the country, people spoke with astonishment, sadness, and uncertainty about what the future would bring. Prince Edward stood solemnly in front of his father's coffin in the Grand Hall of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by nobles, politicians, and members of the royal family. At 19, his face showed a mixture of emotions struggling to surface: sorrow, fear, and a deep sense of abandonment. Though all eyes were on him, Edward felt like a lost child in a world he didn't fully understand. His father had been an imposing figure, filling every room with his presence, and now, in his absence, Edward felt the weight of expectations crashing down on his shoulders. The Archbishop of Canterbury approached him with a solemn step. "Prince Edward, the United Kingdom needs you to take your place on the throne," he said gravely. "The nation requires stability in these uncertain times." Edward swallowed hard, feeling the pressure build in his chest. His gaze turned to his older sister, Lady Eleanor, who stood by his side, holding his hand in a silent gesture of support. Eleanor was the only person he truly trusted. With natural elegance and a sharp mind, she had always been his guide and confidant. "I'm not ready," Edward murmured, barely moving his lips. Eleanor looked at him with concern, but said nothing. The funeral proceeded with the pomp and solemnity expected of a royal event. Crowds gathered in the streets of London to pay their respects to the late king. But while the country bid farewell to Henry VIII, Prince Edward could only think of one thing: the life he was about to lose. Later, in the privacy of a palace room, Edward and Eleanor sat together. The fireplace crackled softly, filling the room with comforting warmth that contrasted with the coldness of the day's conversations. "I can't do it, Eleanor," Edward said with a sigh. "I don't want to be king. I don't want to be a prisoner of traditions that no longer make sense in this world." Eleanor observed him with a mix of compassion and concern. "Edward, it's not just about what you want. It's about the duty you have toward our people." "Duty?" Edward let out a bitter laugh. "Duty toward a system that's outdated, that doesn't represent real people? The monarchy is a relic of the past. I don't want to dedicate my life to something I don't believe in." Eleanor remained silent for a moment, processing her brother's words. She understood his frustration. They had grown up in a rigid environment filled with unbreakable rules, where every move was watched and judged. But she also knew that Edward's refusal to take the throne could trigger a crisis of unimaginable proportions. "And what will you do then?" she finally asked. "Will you run away and let the country fall into chaos?" Edward stood and began pacing the room. "I don't want to run away. I just want to live an authentic life, free from the expectations and obligations imposed by others. I want to find my own path." The following day, the Royal Council met to discuss the situation. The council members were experienced men and women who understood the gravity of the moment. Lord Montgomery, an elderly man with a white beard and a stern demeanor, took the floor. "The people need a monarch. The absence of a king creates uncertainty and weakens our position in the world. Prince Edward must take the throne without delay." Lady Eleanor, who was also present at the meeting, stepped forward to speak. "My brother is grieving. He needs time to reflect on his role and responsibility." But Lord Montgomery shook his head. "Time is a luxury we cannot afford. Every day without a monarch on the throne, our country loses stability." Edward, who had been listening from a corner of the room, finally spoke. "I'm not prepared to be king, and I'm not sure I want to be." The council reacted with murmurs of disbelief. The prince's refusal was an unexpected blow that put the continuity of the monarchy in jeopardy. Lady Eleanor tried to calm the situation, but the disapproving glances were evident. "Edward, please," Eleanor whispered as she took her brother's hand. "Don't make this harder than it already is." But Edward had made his decision. He knew his refusal would have consequences, but he also knew he couldn't be an authentic leader if he didn't believe in the system he was meant to represent. That night, as London slept under a starry sky, Edward stood on the balcony of his room, looking out at the city's lights. He thought of his father, the moments they had shared, and the expectations that had always weighed on him. But he also thought of his own desire to be free, to live a life that made sense to him. Eleanor found him there, standing in silence, lost in thought. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Edward nodded. "Yes. I don't want to live a lie. I don't want to be an empty symbol of a system that needs to change." Eleanor sighed. "Then what will you do?" Edward turned to her with determination in his eyes. "I'm going to leave for a while. I need clarity. And if I decide to return, it will be because I'm ready to be the leader our people deserve, not the one traditions dictate I should be." Eleanor understood, though her heart was torn between loyalty to her brother and responsibility to her country. "Wherever you go, remember that you will always have a place here. And remember that the crown is not just a burden, but also an opportunity to make a difference." Edward smiled faintly. "Maybe. But first, I need to discover who I really am without the shadow of the crown over me." And so, as the bells continued to toll in London, Prince Edward prepared to leave behind the life he had known, seeking answers and perhaps a new purpose. Edward woke before dawn, with London still asleep under a blanket of low-gray clouds. The air was cold, and a light drizzle started to fall, misting the palace windows. As he dressed in simple clothes and packed a few belongings into a leather bag, he felt that every movement took him one step further from the life he had known. There were no formal goodbyes or long speeches. Only Eleanor was there, watching him from the doorway. Her serene but sad eyes followed his every move. "Are you sure this is what you need?" she asked quietly. Edward nodded. "I can't stay here, Eleanor. I need to get away to find clarity. If I remain in London, the expectations and obligations will consume me. I don't want to become someone I'm not." Eleanor sighed and crossed the room to embrace him. "Then go. But don't lose yourself too far. The country will need you sooner or later. And remember, you will always have a home here." Edward didn't respond, but he squeezed his sister's hand lightly before leaving. As he exited through a side door of the palace, he felt the breeze of freedom for the first time in a long while. London faded behind him, along with the invisible chains that had weighed on him. The journey to Doverhaven was long and peaceful. The landscape shifted from the rigid grandeur of the city to the serene greenery of rolling hills and small coastal villages seemingly untouched by time. Edward watched the undulating fields, thatched-roof cottages, and cliffs rising above the sea. Every mile traveled took him further from his previous life and closer to the uncertainty and possibility of something new. Doverhaven was a small, picturesque town with cobblestone streets and stone houses that seemed to defy the passage of time. Upon arrival, Edward decided he needed a new name. Being the heir to the United Kingdom's throne in such a place would be an unbearable burden. He became Edward Carter, an ordinary man seeking peace and anonymity. He rented a modest cabin near the sea, a wooden structure that creaked with every gust of salty wind. From the window of the small living room, he could see the waves crashing against the rocks, a constant reminder of nature's strength and persistence. There, far from royal pressures, Edward allowed himself to breathe freely. The first days in Doverhaven were solitary but comforting. Edward spent hours walking along the beach, collecting smooth stones and watching seagulls glide through the cloudy skies. The sea offered a sense of calm he had never found in palace life. One morning, while strolling through the town square, he noticed a poster announcing a community fair at the local school. He decided to attend, hoping to blend in with the people and better understand life in Doverhaven. It was there that he met Lucy Carter, a young primary school teacher organizing activities for the town's children. Lucy had wavy brown hair that fell softly over her shoulders and clear eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. Her warm, contagious smile immediately intrigued Edward. "Are you new in town?" Lucy asked as she saw him observing the activities from a corner. Edward nodded. "Yes, I just arrived. I'm Edward Carter." Lucy raised an eyebrow, amused. "Carter? Funny, we share the same surname. Where are you from?" Edward hesitated for a moment before answering. "From the north. I needed a change of scenery." Lucy seemed to accept the answer without further questions. "Well, welcome to Doverhaven. We value community here. I hope you find what you're looking for." As days passed, Edward became more involved in town life. He helped with small tasks, like repairing fences and carrying supplies for local fishermen. Though his previous life had been filled with luxury and comfort, he found satisfaction in simple work and direct contact with people. Lucy, for her part, became a constant presence in his life. They often met on the beach or in the square, discussing mundane topics or reflecting on life. Lucy had a practical and compassionate view of the world, which contrasted with the rigid traditions Edward had known in court. One afternoon, as they walked along the shoreline, Lucy said something that deeply resonated with Edward. "Leadership isn't always about sitting on a throne or holding a title. Sometimes, leading means simply being there for others, listening to their needs, and acting with empathy." Edward stopped and gazed at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set behind the clouds. "I always thought leadership was a burden, a weight to be feared. I never saw it as an opportunity to serve." Lucy smiled. "That's because you've always viewed it from the perspective of tradition. But here in Doverhaven, things are different. Here, we take care of each other. There are no titles, just people." Edward felt something shift inside him. Lucy's words, simple yet sincere, made him reconsider many of his beliefs. For the first time, he wondered if his refusal to take the throne had been driven by fear rather than a genuine desire for change. One stormy night, Edward sat by the window of his cabin, listening to the rain lashing against the glass. He picked up a pen and paper and began to write a letter to Eleanor. He wasn't sure if he would send it, but he needed to express his thoughts. "Dear Eleanor, I have found a place where people don't see me as a prince, but as an ordinary man. Here, I am learning that leadership isn't a burden to be feared, but an opportunity to do good. Perhaps I was wrong to reject the crown. Perhaps there is a way to lead that I haven't fully understood yet. I hope you are well. I think of you often. With love, Edward." When he finished the letter, Edward felt lighter. He didn't know how long he would stay in Doverhaven, but he was sure that the town and its people were transforming his view of the world and himself. While Edward was beginning to find peace in Doverhaven, things were worsening in London. The absence of a monarch on the throne had left a power vacuum that the media and politicians quickly amplified. Headlines in newspapers reflected the nation's uncertainty. Who will lead the United Kingdom? Monarchy in crisis, and the missing prince? In the streets, people began to express their concerns. The monarchy had been a cornerstone of British identity for centuries, and the idea of an uncertain future without a king was hard for many to accept. Some citizens supported Edward's decision to refuse the throne, seeing it as a modern, progressive gesture, while others viewed it as a betrayal of his royal duties. In the midst of this chaos, in a stately mansion on the outskirts of London, Lord William Harrington rubbed his hands together with satisfaction. William was a distant relative of the royal family, a man of ambition who had spent years in the shadows waiting for his chance to rise to power. With Edward absent, he saw a golden opportunity to claim the throne. William had grown up among nobility, but had always felt he deserved more. For years, he had cultivated relationships with influential members of the royal council and important political figures. Now, with the country teetering, he was ready to make his move. The prince has abandoned his responsibilities, William declared during a private meeting with some members of the royal council. The United Kingdom cannot afford this uncertainty. We need a leader who is willing to take the throne and provide stability. Lord Montgomery, one of the council's oldest members, regarded William cautiously. And you suggest that you are that leader? William smiled. I am the closest remaining relative, and I am prepared to assume that responsibility. I have spent my life serving the crown, and now it is time to restore the stability our nation needs. The council members exchanged glances. William's proposal was bold, but the crisis they faced required drastic measures. However, Lady Eleanor, who was present at the meeting, stood up with a defiant expression. My brother has not abdicated the throne, she said firmly. Edward needs time to reflect, but he remains the rightful heir. William turned to Eleanor with a condescending smile. With all due respect, Lady Eleanor, your brother has left the throne vacant at a critical moment. The people need a present leader, not a prince who flees from his responsibilities. Eleanor remained steadfast. Leadership is not measured by how quickly someone claims a crown, but by the ability to make just and compassionate decisions. My brother is searching for that balance. William maintained his smile, but his eyes glinted with dangerous ambition. I hope you're right, Lady Eleanor, but time is running out, and the country cannot wait forever. Meanwhile, in Dover Haven, Edward continued with his simple life. He had found temporary work, helping local fishermen, and enjoyed his daily conversations with Lucy. However, the tranquility he had found began to waver when one day he entered a cafe in town and noticed the customers were fixated on a news broadcast. The political crisis in London deepens as Lord William Harrington presents his claim to the throne. With Prince Edward still missing, Harrington argues that the country needs immediate leadership to avoid further instability. Edward felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He slowly approached the screen, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. The image of William speaking to the cameras made Edward clench his fists. He recognized the ambition in his distant relative's eyes and knew that man would not be a fair leader for the people. Lucy, who was behind the cafe counter, noticed Edward's reaction and approached him. Is everything all right? She asked softly. Edward took a moment to respond. Finally, he turned to her and spoke in a low voice. That man, he cannot take the throne. Lucy observed him with curiosity. Why does it concern you so much? Edward struggled between the truth and the secret he had kept since arriving in Dover Haven. But something in Lucy's gaze made him decide. There's something I haven't told you, he began. My real name isn't Edward Carter. I'm Edward, the Prince of the United Kingdom. Lucy stared at him in shock, but remained silent. Edward took the opportunity to continue. I left because I didn't want to be king. I thought I could find my way far from all that. But now I see that by running away, I've put the country in danger. William Harrington is a dangerous man, and if he takes the throne, the people will suffer. Finally, Lucy spoke. I understand why you left, but I also understand that, sometimes, we don't choose the responsibilities we're given. Maybe you don't want to be king, but if it means protecting your people, shouldn't you reconsider? Lucy's words resonated deeply with Edward. He knew she was right. He couldn't keep hiding while the United Kingdom faced a crisis. It was time to return to London and face his destiny. Lady Eleanor received the news with relief and concern when Edward called her. I'm ready to return, Edward said, but I will only do so under one condition. I want to be clear that I will not be a traditional king. I want to lead in a way that truly benefits the people. Eleanor smiled on the other end of the line. That's exactly what our country needs. The crisis in London was reaching its peak. William Harrington was prepared to claim the crown. But with Edward's return, the story was about to take an unexpected turn. Edward's return to London did not go unnoticed. Though he had tried to maintain a low profile, news of his arrival quickly leaked to the press, and within hours, the capital was filled with headlines announcing the return of the lost prince. However, Edward did not head for the palace or the royal council upon his arrival. Instead, he went directly to his sister Eleanor's residence. Eleanor greeted him with a mixture of relief and concern. Seeing him walk through the door, she dropped the papers she was holding and rushed to embrace him. Thank you for coming back, she whispered, holding him tightly. I was afraid it would be too late. Edward returned the embrace, feeling the weight of the moment. I couldn't stand by while someone like William threatens to take the throne. They pulled apart, and Eleanor led him to the sitting room where a crackling fire provided warmth against the cold London afternoon. They sat across from each other, and Eleanor studied him carefully. "You know this won't be easy," she said. "William has already gathered support from the council. Many are convinced that your initial refusal proves you're not ready to be king." Edward nodded slowly. "I know, but I'm here to prove that leadership isn't about a willingness to wear a crown. It's about a willingness to serve the people." Eleanor smiled faintly, pride shining in her eyes. "That's exactly what we need, but you must be ready to confront William. He won't back down easily." Meanwhile, in Dover Haven, Lucy remained at the small cabin Edward had left behind. She had found a letter on the table, written in Edward's neat handwriting. "Dear Lucy, I've decided to return to London to face my destiny. I don't know what awaits me, but I know I can't keep running. Your words help me see that leadership is an opportunity to make a difference, not a burden to avoid. Thank you for everything you've taught me. I hope our paths cross again. Yours, Edward." Lucy pressed the letter to her chest, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. She knew Edward was doing the right thing, but she also feared what might happen to him in London. In the capital, the political situation continued to deteriorate. William Harrington, confident in his imminent rise to the throne, had called for an extraordinary meeting of the Royal Council to discuss his coronation. The press portrayed him as a confident and charismatic figure, but those who knew him well understood that his ambition far outweighed any concern for the nation's welfare. On the day of the meeting, Edward decided to present himself before the council. Eleanor accompanied him, and together they walked through the palace corridors until they reached the grand hall where the council members awaited. Edward's entrance caused an immediate stir. Some council members stood in surprise, while others eyed him with skepticism. "Prince Edward," said Lord Montgomery, rising to his feet, "we are pleased to see you have returned." William, seated at the head of the table, rose slowly. His smile did not reach his eyes. "Edward, what a surprise to see you here. I thought you had abandoned your responsibilities." Edward held William's gaze steadily. "I've returned because I cannot allow someone like you to take the throne." The room erupted in murmurs, and William raised a hand to call for silence. "And what makes you think you are more suited to rule?" William asked. "The country needs a strong leader, not a dreamer." Edward stepped forward. "The country needs a leader who listens to its people, who understands their needs, and who is willing to serve with empathy and justice. The monarchy should no longer be a symbol of power, but a beacon of unity and hope." The murmurs grew louder as council members whispered among themselves. Some nodded slowly in agreement, while others watched Edward with guarded expressions. William laughed dryly. "Nice words, but they're empty. Leadership requires more than good intentions. It requires action." Edward met his gaze calmly. "That's why I'm here. Not for power, but for the responsibility I have to the people. I'm willing to work for them, not use them for my own gain." A heavy silence settled over the room. Lord Montgomery, who had previously been critical of Edward, stood. "The prince is right," he said gravely. "The monarchy must evolve. We've seen too many leaders who seek personal gain. Perhaps it's time for a change." Applause began to fill the room. One by one, council members began to express their support for Edward. William, furious, clenched his fists. "This is a farce," he growled. "You have no idea what you're doing." Edward turned to him. "William, you can't force a country to follow you. Leadership is earned, not seized." Seeing his plan unravel, William stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. His ambition had been defeated. Later that day, Edward addressed the public from the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The streets below were packed with people, and the crowd fell silent as the prince appeared. "I have returned," Edward began, "and I have returned with a promise that the monarchy will be different. I will not stand above you. I will stand alongside you, listening to your concerns and working toward a better future. The speech was met with cheers and applause. For the first time in a long while, the people felt they had a leader who truly cared about them. Eleanor, watching from the side of the balcony, smiled with satisfaction. Edward had found his path, and the United Kingdom was ready to enter a new era. That night, as Edward walked through the palace corridors, he found Eleanor in the library. "You did it," she said with a smile. Edward shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. You helped me see what truly mattered." Eleanor hugged him. "I always knew you'd find your way. And now, it's time for you to walk it." Edward gazed out the window, watching the lights of London shine in the night. He knew the real work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he was exactly where he needed to be. The streets of London were crowded. People gathered in front of Buckingham Palace, anxiously awaiting the resolution of the crisis that had thrown the United Kingdom into uncertainty. Flags fluttered in the wind, and voices rose in chants and questions. The press captured every detail, speculating about the imminent appointment of a new monarch. Edward stood by a window in the palace, gazing at the crowd with a furrowed brow. The responsibility he had tried to avoid for so long now stared him directly in the face. The fate of the country rested on his decisions. "It's time," Eleanor said as she entered the room. Her voice was firm, but her eyes reflected concern. "The council will meet in a few minutes. William will be there as well." Edward nodded and adjusted his jacket. "I won't let him take the throne, but I'm not going to play his game of ambition. I will speak directly to the council and, if necessary, to the people." Eleanor smiled with pride. That's what a true leader would do. The grand hall of the royal council was filled. Council members, nobles, and political leaders waited expectantly. William Harrington, dressed in an impeccable black velvet cape, paced the room with a triumphant air. "It's a shame Edward didn't value his heritage," William said to one of the senior council members. "But don't worry. I'm ready to assume the leadership our country needs." The door swung open, and all eyes turned to Edward, who entered with a determined stride. His presence commanded respect. He wore simple clothing, far from the ostentatious royal attire of old, but his demeanor conveyed dignity and resolve. "William," Edward said as he approached his distant cousin, "you can't lead a country if your motivation is power." William looked at him with disdain. "And you can't lead if you run from your responsibilities. The people need a strong king, not a dreamer." Edward stepped into the center of the room and, with a steady voice, addressed the council. For centuries, the monarchy has been seen as a symbol of power and privilege. But today, we are here because that system no longer works. The people don't need a king who sits on a golden throne. They need a leader who listens to their concerns and works alongside them to build a better future. The murmurs spread throughout the room. Some council members nodded slowly, while others watched Edward with skepticism. "I left London because I felt I couldn't meet the expectations placed on me," Edward continued. "But in my time away, I've learned that leadership isn't about following archaic traditions. It's about serving with empathy and justice. I'm here to offer a new vision for our monarchy, one that serves the people, not stands above them." William interrupted with a sarcastic laugh. "And how do you plan to achieve that? Will you give up all the privileges of royalty? Will you become one of the people?" Edward looked at him serenely. "I'm willing to reform the monarchy to make it relevant in the modern world. I'm willing to listen to the people and work alongside them. And if that means giving up unnecessary privileges, I will do so without hesitation." A heavy silence settled over the room. Lord Montgomery, who had been critical of Edward in the past, stood. "The prince is right," he said gravely. "The monarchy must evolve. We've seen too many leaders who seek their own gain. Perhaps it's time for a change." Applause began to fill the hall. One by one, the council members began to express their support for Edward. William, furious, clenched his fists. "This is a farce," he growled. "You have no idea what you're doing." Edward turned to him. William, you can't force a country to follow you. Leadership is earned, not seized. Seeing his plan unravel, William stormed out of the hall, slamming the door behind him. His ambition had been defeated. Later that day, Edward addressed the public from the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The streets below were packed with people, and the crowd fell silent as the prince appeared. "I have returned," Edward began, "and I have returned with a promise that the monarchy will be different. I will not stand above you. I will stand alongside you, listening to your concerns and working toward a better future." The speech was met with cheers and applause. For the first time in a long while, the people felt they had a leader who truly cared about them. Eleanor, watching from the side of the balcony, smiled with satisfaction. Edward had found his path, and the United Kingdom was ready to enter a new era. That night, as Edward walked through the palace corridors, he found Eleanor in the library. "You did it," she said with a smile. Edward shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. You helped me see what truly mattered." Eleanor hugged him. "I always knew you'd find your way. And now, it's time for you to walk it." Edward gazed out the window, watching the lights of London shine in the night. He knew the real work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he was exactly where he needed to be. The day of the coronation arrived with a sense of renewal that could be felt throughout the United Kingdom. However, this would not be a traditional ceremony. Edward had made it clear that he wanted something different, something that reflected the new vision he carried with him. Westminster Abbey, with its centuries of history and rigid traditions, was set aside. Instead, the ceremony would take place in Doverhaven, the coastal town that had changed Edward's life forever. The streets of Doverhaven were adorned with garlands of flowers and flags. The town's residents, who had known Edward as an ordinary man, now prepared to see him take the throne, not as a distant monarch, but as one of their own. Lucy Carter stood at the local school, watching the preparations with a mix of pride and emotion. She had received a personal invitation from Edward to attend the ceremony, but she was still unsure whether to accept. The memory of their last conversation lingered in her mind, and his words resonated deeply in her heart. Meanwhile, on a stage set up near the beach, Edward prepared to address the crowd. He wore a simple blue tunic, far from the ostentatious royal attire of the past. Eleanor stood by his side, offering silent support. "Are you ready?" Eleanor asked with a smile. Edward nodded. "I am. For the first time in my life, I feel I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Edward's speech was brief but powerful. "Today, I don't just take a crown," he began. "Today, I make a commitment to serve the people. The monarchy can no longer be a symbol of privilege, but a beacon of unity, empathy, and justice." The crowd erupted in applause. There was something in Edward's words that touched the hearts of those listening. He wasn't a distant, imposing leader. He was someone who had learned to listen and understand. "For too long," he continued, "the monarchy has been disconnected from the people. That must change. My promise is to reform this institution so that it reflects modern values of inclusion, equality, and service. I will not be a king who rules from a golden throne. I will be a leader who walks alongside you." In the crowd, Lucy felt her heart quicken. Edward's words were sincere, and she could see the transformation in him. Finally, she made her decision and began to walk toward the stage. Edward saw her approaching, and for a moment his face lit up with a genuine smile. When Lucy reached the foot of the stage, Edward stepped down to meet her. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Lucy confessed. Edward took her hands. "I'm glad you did. I wouldn't have made it here without you." Lucy looked into his eyes. "So, what's next?" Edward smiled. "Now, the real work begins. But I know I'm not doing it alone." With the ceremony concluded, Edward and Lucy walked together through the streets of Doverhaven. People greeted them enthusiastically, and Edward stopped to speak with everyone who approached. There were no guards or barriers separating him from the crowd. He was an accessible king, ready to listen and learn. As they strolled, Lucy stopped in front of the school. "This is where it all started for us." Edward nodded. This is where I learned what it truly means to lead." Lucy smiled. "And are you ready to lead that way?" Edward looked at her with determination. More than ever. In the days that followed, Edward began implementing his reforms. He opened direct communication channels with the public, creating forums where citizens could voice their concerns and suggestions. He reduced royal expenditures and redirected those funds to community and educational projects. His practical and compassionate approach quickly gained support, even from those who had initially doubted his ability to lead. Lady Eleanor became one of his key advisors, ensuring that the reforms were effectively implemented and that Edward's vision remained true to his principles. "You achieved something many thought impossible," Eleanor said one day as they walked through the palace gardens. "You've modernized the monarchy without losing its essence." Edward smiled at her. "I didn't do it alone. It's been a collective effort." Eleanor nodded. "But it all started with you." Time passed, and Edward's vision became a reality. The United Kingdom entered a new era of unity and progress, led by a king who had learned that true power lies in serving others with empathy and humility. In Dover Haven, the local school was renamed Lucy Carter School in honor of her contributions to the community. Edward visited the town frequently, always remembering where he came from and what the town had taught him. One afternoon, as he walked along the beach, Edward saw Lucy standing by the shore. They stopped to watch the sea together, in silence. "You've changed many things," Lucy said. Edward smiled. "Thanks to you." Lucy looked at him warmly. "And what's next for you?" Edward picked up a stone and threw it into the sea. "Keep learning, keep listening, and keep leading with my heart." The sun set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. It was a new day for the United Kingdom, and Edward was ready to face it with the same humility and determination that had brought him there. Edward's story wasn't about a king seeking power. It was about a man who found his purpose by discovering the true meaning of leadership. And with every step he took, he left an indelible mark on the history of his people.